Welcome back to the Freebirds Cape Scarf tutorial playlist. I want to focus today on more yarn selections that you could possibly use for the cape scarf. As we are Freebirds, and I want you to feel free to use any yarn you want to use. Just know that you're going to have a little math to work in for your gauge. And let me start out with this, showing you this first. This is how I look at yarn selection. All right, this is some laundry detergent. This is Arm & Hammer. My husband bought this when they had the raid on the toilet paper. They also got short on laundry detergent that I like. I like all packets, and so he got this Arm & Hammer. I don't recommend it for washing because it fades your colors really bad. And it's just a little harsh in my opinion. So anyway, I went to open this bag just a few minutes ago and get some laundry in the washer. And first you have to rip this off. And then you have to hold here. You have to read all these directions. And you'll see where I'm going with this as far as yarn selection goes. But you have to hold here and you have to push this little tab really hard. And that unlocks the zipper. Makes it where the zipper will open. Then I don't know if you have to do it every time you want to get in this bag. I'm just going to leave the dang thing open. So you finally get into the bag and get what you're after. So that's kind of how I look at yarn selections when it comes to designing and looking for substitution yarn for maybe patterns that you have that you don't know what's going to work. I mean, you don't know if your gauge is going to work with their gauge. I want you to grow along with me. That's why I have made this particular project a design journey, because I don't want to spoon feed you. I want to help people learn to create things on their own, to utilize the mind that God gave us, and not be confined to what's on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and someone else's ideas. You know, take someone else's such and such and roll with it. Do your own thing to it. You don't have to stay in a box with your crochet or knitting or whatever it is you do. So moving on to our Freebird cape scarf. I started with first deciding I wanted to do something different than I had planned with the cookie yarn. That's the cookie yarn. It is by Hobby, as you've heard if you've been following this playlist. And then I had also picked up some of the Chloe yarn. This was my first swatch. I had picked up some Chloe yarn from Hobby Lobby. Both of these are a 4-weight worsted, but ball bands can be deceiving. We know they're not always straight up honest. So I didn't like how, and also you have the density of the stitch. The feather stitch is quite dense. This is not the stitch I'm using. This was a stitch I had thought about using, so I swatched it first just to see how they work together. That's a very stretchy stitch, and this is not as stretchy. But this seemed more flimsy with the Chloe, and that's just held single. So yesterday, even though I have a big section, if you watch my video I just put up today, I have a big section for the body of the feather stitch completed in the cookie yarn. And I showed that on my video I just put up. So yesterday I had a bunch of that done and decided I'm going to go ahead and make my pockets. You know, I have a good feel for what size I want them, how many stitches I need to start with, how many chains. So I did a chain of 28 and did 2 pockets in the feather stitch. So I did these 2 pockets. They're a little off from each other because I didn't color control at all. I didn't want to waste any yarn and have unnecessary tails to weave in. I also left, you want to consider this, you're going to be sewing these pockets on. I just left some yarn in case I want to sew them on with the yarn that I made them with. Most likely I'm going to use, because it's going, these two pockets are going to go on the other section that has the Chloe. So these would be on top of this section. And I'm most likely going to use the Chloe yarn to sew these pockets on, and vice versa. When I sew the Chloe pockets onto the feather stitch section, you know, the bigger pieces, I'll probably use the cookie yarn to whip stitch those on. I like the look of the whip stitching, the contrast it'll have, but I don't want to reverse my garment and decide to wear it flip-flopped and, you know, right side up, upside down, whatever you want to call it. This is a reversible garment. I don't want to see my whip stitching on the larger sections when I flip my piece around. So if you don't know what I'm talking about here, go back and look at my video that has this schematic in it. It's in this playlist, but the schematic will you'll give an idea of how this garment can be worn without seeing the completed garment. I don't want to see this thread riding along on top of this when I'm wearing it with the side out. So, and vice versa. I don't want to see this thread coming through on the right side out if that's not the side I'm using. So that may be more information than you need to know for now. back to our regular scheduled programming. Yesterday I got to looking at why the Chloe, it just doesn't seem to have the density in the feather stitch. Here's a piece I did in the feather, or not the feather stitch, I'm sorry, in the Trinity Stitch. There's no real, you can't see the little flowers, or I think it looks like a little bird's eye, or similar to the star stitch. But you can't see that so much on this piece. That is the Chloe held single. So this section here, I'm just trying to show you how to pair up two different yarns. Even though no matter what the ball band says. I mean, you don't want to get too far out of range of each other. You wouldn't want to pair like a super bulky with a fingering weight. You'd have to probably hold 3 or 4 fingering weights together to equal those super bulky, or even get close. So I just started feeling these. So if you have two different yarns, kind of roll them in your fingers and get a feel, you know, all the way down the yarn, because these single plies, if you're using a single ply yarn, you'll notice they're roving type yarns, and a lot of times they tend to get thinner and thicker. This one doesn't do it so much. This one stays pretty consistent. This one here is pretty consistent, but it just feels a little bit thicker in my fingers as I rolled them. And it's definitely laying a lot more flimsy than the cookie in the feather stitch. I don't know if you can see the chunkiness difference, and that's hard to show on camera. But this one is much more dense, puffy, I would say. And this is much more drapey in the Trinity Stitch and held single. So what I did to remedy that situation, and this is how I equate it to opening the laundry detergent bags. It takes some work to get to the product that you want. And that's what we're aiming for here. A product, an end garment, getting to the end of this journey. You want to have a garment that you like wearing, that you're satisfied with. Who wants to spend all this money and time on yarn and crocheting, unless you're totally a process crocheter, where you just love the process so much, you just want to stitch all the time and not care about the finished product. So people either tend to be more of a process stitcher or a product stitcher. I'm kind of a blend of both, especially now that I'm teaching tutorials. You know, when you're teaching, you want to teach someone how to come up with something that they're going to like. So you can't just plow through it and be a total process stitcher. So this piece here, I just held the Chloe double. The feather stitch I held single. It's in the cookie yarn. I held it single and I used an H hook for that. 28 chains I started with. This one, same size of a square. So we got 2 pockets the same size. That was important to me. And it's also 28 chains to start with. They both work with a stitch multiple of 2, starting, chain of 2. So you chain up 2 on each of them. This one, it feels a little bit heavier, but I got closer to the density that I want. This one feels a little heavier. This one feels a little lighter, but the density was important to me. I didn't want to have a really flim-flam part of it with something that's a little fluffier. Not much fluffier. I mean, there's a big difference in the thickness of this and the thickness of that. So this got me a happy medium. As a result, if you're going to double your Chloe, if you use Chloe, you're going to need, you're going to need close to double the yarn. Out of one skein, I balled one skein up into 2 balls, and I got 2 pockets with this and another little bit left over. So this is very usable still. It's a good piece of yarn. But this is one skein of yarn, almost a whole skein of yarn for 2 pockets. So I will be doing some math with my schematic and my gauge, but you have to realize that your gauge might not exactly match mine. Do whatever you need to do to make the size you want, but my math basically goes like this. I've got in the schematic, I'm going to grab that. In your schematic, which is available on Instagram, go back to my schematic video and click the link below for this schematic. But I look at it this way. When you're trying to figure out your yardage, are you going to have enough? First of all, don't buy a yarn that that is going to be discontinued or is discontinued. Get something that's been around for a while. So these 2 pockets here that I did in the Chloe, they are, oh gee whiz, I need to not move when I do these videos. These 2 pockets without blocking are about 7.5 inches square. So if I take the 7.5 times 7.5, that'll give me the area of one of the squares in inches, in square inches. So then I multiply that by 2 because I got 2 squares out of one skein. You don't have to get the specific. If you get your hands on a lot of the yarn, go for it. But I'm trying to make it where you can do the math yourself to be sure you're going to have enough yarn if you want to use something you have on hand. So doing that math, 7.5 times 7.5 would equal X. Okay, then I take X times 2 because I got 2 pockets. And that would be the total square inch area I got out of one skein of yarn with the 2 pockets and the one skein of yarn. So then I would take that and use the total square inches and then figure up how much I'm going to need, for this Trinity Stitch section. If you're making it without these 3¼ inch borders at each end, you're making it 73.5, or if you're just going to make it straight across with no borders, and you're going to make it 80 inches, take your 16 inches by however long you want your piece, and multiply those 2 numbers, 16 times X stitches, either 73.5, whatever number, however long you want it. Then that will give you how many square inches your body piece is. Take that number, and we figured one skein already with your first number, your X that you came up with, your square inches for these 2 pockets. Take this square inch number and divide it by that square inch number, and that is going to give you your number of skeins that you need. This seems very complicated, but it's really not. Square inch areas, your area squared, divided by this. And that's going to be the number of skeins you need. So you don't have to go to the trouble of all that math. The more important math is your gauge, or you can just make for your body a big long chain of even number of stitches. And if you have extra, just don't use those chains and pull those chains out later. I do that quite often with my swatches. I do it often with a garment, just to be sure I have enough chains to get it to at least the width that I want it. So those are my pockets that I am using. I recommend your pockets be 6 to 8 inches square, big enough for your hand. So just look at your hand and take a guesstimate. Also, I don't know if I said this part, while I used an H-hook on these, the Chloe double, holding the Chloe double, I used a J-hook. Same number of chains started with, 28 chains on both of these, and they are the same size. Don't know how that worked out. I really don't understand why that worked. Probably has something to do with the two different stitches, but they worked up to the same gauge. Two different hooks and the same gauge. So I was happy with that. Worked out well for me. You can save yourself the time and hassle if you don't want to work with the crochet hook sizes I'm using or figure out all that, working with two different yarns. And you could go for two yarns that are the same. So something like this would be a good combination. These are both I Love This yarn from Hobby Lobby. Just some I had in my little cabinet. And both the same weight. One's a nice print, you might call it variegated, and the other one has a little bit of tonal variation to it, like a kettle dye, and a violet color. Sorry, that's blurry. I'm trying to get it to refocus. So those two would work nice together. Same weights, physically the same weight, and they're both number 4s. Here is a swatch I had worked up from another tutorial on a more aesthetic star stitch. I don't have a gap at the end, but the star stitch looks similar to the Trinity Stitch. It has a lot of similarity to it. So that is made with I Love This yarn from Hobby Lobby. So you can kind of visualize, you know, the weight and the look of the I Love This yarn. And it's acrylic. So this would be a good option also if you're allergic to wool, because the Chloe is 70% wool. And also not machine washable. So worsted acrylic weight, find you two you like, and go for it. That's an easy peasy problem solver there. You know, do your gauge swatch with your pockets and figure out how many stitches to the inch you're getting from how many chains you used for that, and make a bigger rectangle for your body piece. Another alternative I have mentioned and was the Lion Brand Ferris wheel. But with the Ferris wheel, there really aren't any that are solid or semi-solid. There's some that are tonal, like a green and blue mixture, but they get kind of stripy. This yarn would work great for the feather section. Here's another one. They would be beautiful worked up with the feather stitch. But when it comes to the Trinity, you're going to come across the same problem and need to find a yarn that is comparable to how this works up in the feather stitch, because it's a single ply, and the single plies are very hard to come by in solids and semi-solids. So that kind of presents the same problem that the cookie yarn does. I also, today, I worked up this piece. This is in Lion Brand Landscapes. It is a medium weight 4, and it recommends a K hook. I think I used a J hook, but just to see the size difference, I went ahead and chained up 28. Started with a chain of 28, just like I did my pockets I'm actually going to use. And this is the size difference on those. The landscapes comes out, it's about 1 inch bigger. And I really felt like using the J hook with this feather stitch, it is way too puffy. It's hard to see where you need to put your stitches. The yarn is kind of shiny. I'm not even sure I can think of a yarn to pair with this yarn. I have tried several times to use this landscapes yarn to make something and pair it with another yarn, and I can't come up with anything to pair with it. Maybe a bamboo yarn would work well with landscape if that's what you want to use, but just know that if you use the landscapes, you're most likely to be comfortable stitching the feather stitch, going to have to be using a pretty big hook. I would guess a K or an N, and you're going to need a bigger roving type yarn, or because of the weight of this, you might be able to get by with pairing it with a regular worsted. But then you're going to come across things like sheen versus flat, you know. This has got some shine to it, and this doesn't. So, bamboo, I would recommend some kind of bamboo worsted weight to go with that, if that's what you want to use. So, I just wanted to throw some options out there. If you already have your yarn picked out and you're happy with them, and you've made your pockets already, and you're happy with your 2 pockets and how the 2 yarns feel together, stick with what you got, and you don't have to even watch all this video, which you probably already have. So this is just a little bit more info on alternative yarns, because I don't want people confined to X yarn and X yarn, X and Y. I want you to have every letter of the alphabet to choose from, and make it in whatever gauge you want to make it in. You just have to do a little math to work up into your schematic dimensions. So that is that, and stay tuned. I'm waiting on yarn to finish the body section of the feather stitch, and then I'm going to be putting up a video. Should be my next video, will be on how many stitches I started with for this feather stitch section, how many stitches you might start with if you're making the same gauge I am, of how many, chains that you start with, chaining up for the feather stitch section. And then I'm going to go straight from talking about that to showing how to start your Trinity stitch and your other yarn and leaving your arm openings. So that will be in the next video of this playlist. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day or night wherever you are.